Yeah, I appreciate Kent's prayer, thanking God for me to be here today, because you never know what you're going to get when you've got something, and to be thankful for it ahead of time is pretty good. So whatever you're going to get, being thankful for it, I think we're taught something about that. I mean, I'm going to get to a couple of parables, I promise you. My introduction, I'm not sure I'll make it all the way through. I look forward to coming here once a year. I dread it and I anticipate it both, because I have no idea what I will talk about and what seems appropriate. It's not like, I'm not your shepherd. I'm not here with you all the time and caring for you as you care for me. I'm not your teacher. I don't have any idea what you need to be taught. And so I'm always wondering what I can possibly say to you that might be of some use beyond just the pure entertainment value of it. So there's always something, isn't there? What I've really tried to do in the past few times I've been here is just tell you about some of our folks and the opportunities we've had to interact with a variety of different people. And that's really, I've really enjoyed that personally, and I don't want to touch the microphone, do I? What I'd like to do today is take a little bit different approach. It'll kind of wind up the same, but I don't know how much you know about Englewood Church, where I'm from, and its history and the things that have precipitated some of the actions that we do. So I thought it would be really helpful to give you just a bit of background. So you might have some understanding of some of the things that we're involved in. About 1990, Englewood was a church on a rapid decline, and people who are familiar with how churches function and what happens understood that Englewood would not be around much longer. Englewood was a dying church. Englewood was on life support. We were getting resources from outside everywhere we could just to try and sustain ourselves. People at Englewood didn't think we internally had the resources we need to be a church or to be anything. We had been a large church through all of our history, from the late 1890s to the 1970s, a church of 3,000 members, maybe 1,200 attendees on a Sunday. And so by the late 80s, Englewood had deteriorated in a variety of different ways. There had been multiple splits. Very charismatic pastors had left, and not so charismatic pastors had come. And so by the late 80s, there may have been 300 people who attended, and on occasion, and that would be generous. But there wasn't a sense of being a church and what being a church was about. And so a lot of things were tried, a lot of programs were tried, and when the last pastor in the 80s left, it was a predicament, because we didn't have money like we'd had before. We didn't have resources like we'd had before. Now, that's not to say we didn't have resources, and it's certainly not to say that God didn't have money and resources, but we didn't understand that we had resources or understand the resources we had. But eventually, a select group of men in the church put out an appeal for another, not necessarily a new, but another pastor, and there were some applicants. It was a different pool of people than would have applied to be a minister, a preacher, a pastor at Englewood in the 60s or the 70s. Because in those decades, we would have had the leading personalities in the Christian churches. But by 1990, those people, there were other opportunities, there were better opportunities, and going to a little dying church in inner city Indianapolis was not something they were looking for. I figured that once we got a new preacher, pastor, minister, that would completely kill us, frankly. I thought that would be the last straw that broke the camel's back. And I wasn't bashful about telling people that. But regardless, one was hired. And to my amazement, he was an unusual guy. His name is Mike Bowling, and he's still there, and I'm thankful that he is. Mike came from a different background. He really wanted to be in urban places. He wanted to be in places that needed the love of God expressed in non-traditional ways, in ways that were not the way we'd always done things. And he had come from a background in Pittsburgh, which was where he had been before as a pastor in an interesting congregation there, and also running a ministry that served about 1,000 high school aged children in a variety of different programming. So it was a really learning experience for him in Pittsburgh, but it was also an experience that he felt he had to get away from because it was killing him. It was more than he could take. But he learned significant things. He brought some unusual things to us, but one of the unusual things is really what I wanted to start with today, because it's kind of just a thought experiment, something to think about. He came, and one of the things that as he and I talked, he talked about was that everything happens, all the things that we do in our life, all the things that we do in any of the practices of our life, in the instances of our life, in our churches, in our schools, in everything we do, in buying a product, everything we do fits this dynamic, and that is, as he expressed it, these three words: conviction, practices, stories. And that's, you can think of it as a circle, and on each place of the circle, you've got over here convictions, over here you've got practices, over here you've got stories, and you can jump into it anywhere. But what you do comes from the convictions you have. So you do stuff, you do all kinds of stuff, and everything you do, everything we do, everything you do as a person or as a church or as a school comes from certain convictions about what it is to be a person, a church, a school, a driver on the road, an employee in a factory. There's convictions. You have convictions. We all have convictions. And those convictions get worked out in practices. And you can be in the same situation and have different practices because you have different convictions. So if you are an employee over here across the street at Allison, they've got all kinds of employees. And I'll bet some of those employees really appreciate their job, do a hard day's work, and go home thankful for what they've got at the end of the day. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's not some employees that grumble about their work and do everything they can to avoid every bit of work they can. And I say that because I'm a person, and I know lots of people who work for us, people who work for other people who've worked for places like Allison and brag about how much money they make and how little work they do. So, and then vice versa, people who go in and take a great deal of pride in their work and really work for the contribution they make. And so we all have convictions, we all have practices, we all have then the stories that we tell. And everywhere within this circle, conviction, practice, story, there's got to be discernment. So between convictions and practices, there's some kind of discernment that is exercised. You know, what practice from this conviction are you going to enact? What are you going to do? You've got this conviction, so now what are you going to do? You're going to do something. How do you decide what you're going to do? How do you as a church or a school or a business decide what you're going to do? And then, after you've established certain practices, there are stories told. And so in churches especially, there's all kinds of stories told. And so when you're in a big church like Inglewood was, there were all kinds of stories told about the very same practices and about the same convictions, but different stories. And some of the stories were wonderful, and some of the stories were terrible. And sometimes I will tell stories about growing up at Inglewood, and other people there who grew up at the same time I did say, "What are you talking about? That's not what I remember." But we all have these different stories because we discerned the practices differently. And so then we tell the stories about them differently because it's what we see as different things. We saw different things happening. So, and then once we've got this story told, then that story informs our convictions again. Because we tell this story and we say, "Oh, this was a terrible thing, we've got to fix it." Or we say, "Oh, it's a wonderful thing, let's keep doing it." And so you're going to act on your convictions relative to what the story is you're telling. If your story is terrible, you're going to change some convictions and you're going to change some practices, and so that the story changes. So it's this revolving thing. And that's a simplified device, okay? It's pretty simple. It can get a little more complicated because there's more going on in us as human beings than just convictions, practices, stories. We're all formed somehow. You were raised by people. You were not just turned loose the day you were born and became what you are. Somebody raised you somehow, and those people had convictions, practices, and stories, and they shaped you into those. They shaped me into those. And we have desires. We want stuff. We want things. We want power. We want things our way. We have with us this weekend, my wife and I, some grandchildren. They're very young. They want what they want. And it's just incredible how somebody so young can be so full of want. But they can, and they can let you know when what they want is not what they're getting. So, or when what they're getting is, not what they want. So we've got all this stuff going on in us, and that weighs into our convictions. So I wanted to, that's really a large thing that I want to tell you today is convictions, practices, stories. As we at Inglewood were going through this end-of-life experience, we recognized that the stories we were telling about what church is and the practices that we practiced, the things that we did as a church, and the convictions about what being a church meant were inadequate for where we were. We could have stuck with our convictions, practices, and stories, those things that had served us well through the 60s and into the 70s, but in the 80s just didn't work. They were not adequate. They weren't what we needed. They did not provide what needed to happen in that church. So we could have died with our convictions, practices, and stories, and churches do. Churches will do that, and people will do that when it's not necessary. So we started to evaluate, to discern, to talk about some of our practices, because we recognized the stories that were, the current story of our church was not, didn't have much future. And if we wanted to exist as a church, we needed to figure out some things. What's God up to? Is God up to anything? What is it to be a church? What does being a church have to do with what God's up to? There's lots of questions out there. Those questions were questions we were asking then. Those are questions we're still asking now and still trying to figure it out. And I'd say we've made some headway, but we haven't got it licked yet. So, and that's kind of the way it is with all of us because times change. What's going on out there in the world changes, and the people coming in change, and we all change as we have different formative experiences, as we tell different stories and hear different stories. So you have heard me say from here that one of the things that we really shifted our mentality on was about loving one another. If you've heard nothing else I've ever said on the times I've been here previously, it's that we came to believe that Jesus said, "By this will all men know that you're my disciples, that you love one another." He didn't say that you teach one another the right morality or that you judge each other by this standard of ethics, but that you love one another. And what we had done a really poor job of was loving one another. We had been really busy with lots of church stuff, and we had been really busy with giving lots of stuff away to people who were not one another with us, but we'd totally ignored one another. We had ignored the health of the church. And so we recognized that something needed to happen. We needed to love one another. I mean, frankly, that's what needed to happen. We needed to learn how to love each other. And love is one of those things that when you start talking about what it is, you have to start putting some real terms on it. And so if somebody needs a little something, it's providing that something, but it's also going beyond it and finding out if that little something is what they really need, or if there's not really something more, there's something more significant. So love was a new practice for us. New practice, frankly, new practice. We like to stand around and talk about love, but actually loving, that's a tough one. Some other practices that we embraced were conversation. We didn't talk to each other. You know, in a big church, you have little groups of people, and each has their own little domain, and they have their conversation with each other. But it's typically a bunch of people that think the same thing, and they're going to come up with something, and they're not going to listen to some voice from outside because it's a threat. Voices from outside are a threat. And so you want to stop those voices. Well, and that's how it works in larger churches a lot of times, is there's little groups of people that have different roles and think they have different authorities. And those things, it kind of works that way. We started talking more broadly and talking about everything. You know, things were not off limits, and conversations were not closed particularly. So when something came up, get as many people talking about it as possible and get that conversation as broad as possible, because there may be some wisdom out there that we've neglected previously, which is always the case. We also started a real practice of reading. We were not a big bunch of readers, and the stuff that we read was pretty much popular religious writing, and that's all well and good, I suppose, but it certainly hadn't provided us with the resources that we needed to sustain ourselves as a healthy church, or even as a dying church. So we started reading more broadly, and it's that reading that I really thought about as I was thinking about coming here today, because this last winter for me was just a great winter for reading, and it was, I mean, I read a lot of stuff, and it's good, and I've appreciated it so much and wish that I'd had it when I was 18 or 20 years old, but I'm glad I have it now. And a couple of those books that I read, one was titled Early Christian Care for the Poor. I wrote it down. It's kind of a long title. Early Christian Care for the Poor, an Alternative Subsistence Strategy Under Roman Imperial Rule. Casey Richardson, a professor at Johnson Christian University, wrote it. It's a really good book. I was amazed. I was dumbfounded. You know, Early Christian Care for the Poor doesn't sound all that exciting, but he went through the scriptures and talking about Jesus and Paul and the gospel writers, and how much of what they were talking about was for the members of the church to care for one another. Because what was happening in Israel was, well, as the title says, Roman imperial rule was happening for one thing. And so there's a Roman influence, but there's also a Greek influence. And there are elites of the Romans, and there are elite people in the Greeks, and there are elites in the Israel society. And so in a village in Israel at the time, there would have been Richardson says maybe 2 or 3% of the population would have been landowners who had slaves, who had servants, who had land, who had stuff. They had excess. 90% of the population lived at a subsistence level. So whose job is it for those people living at a subsistence level to survive? Well, under the law, it's the people who have to care for their brothers and sisters. It's not the people who are at subsistence level to go out and struggle for what they can and hopefully not starve to death. So Richardson's book, Early Christian Care for the Poor, was just wonderful in the sense that, you know, what a lot of the New Testament is about is taking care of those who need taken care of, really looking to one another's needs and owning up to your responsibility. I mean, it's nice once we get ours to go off with all the other people who've gotten theirs, but it's more to the example of Christ to not claim those privileges for ourselves, but to care for one another. So that book has really infected my thinking since then. And in a way, that's what we've tried to do at Englewood, but without Casey Richardson's nice book that helped me to kind of put it into words. Another book that I read once over the winter, and then I'm involved in reading it with some other people now, is one titled A Secular Age by a guy named Charles Taylor. And it's a very well-known book. Lots of people have it on their shelf. Lots of people have not taken it off the shelf yet. And so you can buy them out there, you know, pretty cheap, because after enough years on the shelf, people will sell it and try and get a little money back out of it. But it's what he's writing about is how contemporary the world we live in as Westerners, as modern Westerners, as North Atlantic people, has come to be secular. It's so what the basic thing that he's explaining in his book is how in 1500 it was virtually impossible for anybody in Western cultures, society, to not believe in God. To not believe in God was impossible. In 2000, to believe in God is virtually impossible. So most of our citizens, most of our fellow citizens in Indianapolis, in the United States, in Northern Hemisphere, for them to actually believe in God is really, really hard. It's a big feat of work. And nobody can just naively believe in God now, as people could then. So it's a great book. He explains that if he was going to do a thorough job, he'd have to do a whole lot more than he did. He did a lot as it is. So that has been really informative, because even in our secular world that we live in, all of the morality out there is informed by our Christian past. So love, I mean, where do you not see the notion of love expressed? But the notion of love is expressed in ways that we as Christians wouldn't expect or understand or condone. I run. I always, on the first Saturday of May, I run down Main Street out here in Speedway and look for you all, so I could, with 40,000 of my other friends, if I see you, or if you see me out there, yell, okay? So I was running down Mass Ave the other day, and I noticed on the front pillars of a store there, over on one side, there's the big word love, and on the other side, there's the word guide. And as I looked closer, I could see up here above there was the word let, and down here underneath the word guide is you. So it let love guide you. Well, wouldn't that be great if love could guide you? If love was some set standard. But how do we decide what love is? So that's what we at Englewood have been struggling with for a long time. We were just talking before church started about a standard for mold. And since I work with houses, I work with mold sometimes. And people complain about mold, and we say, okay, I don't know what we can do, but we can do something. But there's no standard for mold, and people want to call Channel 6 and have them come out and, and it's tough. But when there's no set standard for anything, but we have, I think, some insight. So that's what I read this year. That's my introduction. Hopefully the message will not be nearly as long. So with those things in mind, I wanted to share with you two parables that I've appreciated. One, appreciated especially because of its inclusion in Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. And the other because it's a personal favorite, and I'm in a variety of book groups now. We have a lot of different people reading a lot of different books. And so I'm in 4 different groups of people reading different books. One of them is a book on parables. So the first parable I'd like to share with you, you'll recognize. It's in Luke. It starts with, say, verse 25 is a good place to start. What chapter? 10. 10, obviously. Luke 10:25. And Luke writes this, "And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And he said to him, 'What is written in the law? How does it read to you?' And he answered and said, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.' And he said to him, 'You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live.' But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" That messes it all up. Really. Jesus replied and said, "A certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him, and went off, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a certain priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands?" And he said, "The one who showed mercy toward him." And Jesus said, "Go and do the same." He didn't. So that parable, it's by our standards, is a little awkward because Jesus doesn't just tell the guy who his neighbor is. He tells him what a neighbor is and says, "Go do likewise." And most of the explanations I've ever heard for that parable have been great, have just been great, but they've kind of left me with a little but. I want a little bit more. And so in Taylor's book, as I was rereading part of it recently, there was a social critic, defrocked Catholic priest, very devout Catholic, named Ivan Illich. Ivan Illich, South America. He was an Austrian philosopher who became a priest. But then he went to South America, and he was a kind of a liberation movement guy, but that's not where we're going. I'm not exactly a liberation movement guy. So Illich, though, talking about that Samaritan story, saw in it something that just turned me around in some ways. But what he says is there's this element of contingency. of just pure chance. And so the Samaritan's going along, as are the priest and the Levite, and they don't expect to encounter this person beating. They don't have a plan for what they're going to do. They haven't, the priest and the Levite haven't developed a ministry for dealing with people who've been robbed on the road to Jericho. And so they walk by on the other side. What else can you do? But the Samaritan responds to this person, responds to the person, and the person speaks to him. And the Samaritan doesn't operate out of some higher motives or great theological insights. He operates out of this person interacting with him, needing help. This person needed him, and he took care of it. He just took care of it. It wasn't, let's run this through some kind of a grid and see if it fits our idea of what we should do. He just took care of it, and he didn't need to take care of it. I mean, in the social world of that day, there was no claim on him to take care of this, but he did it because this person, this human being, called to him, and he responded. And so that has been, just in the few weeks since I've read it, has been a powerful thing to me in reflecting on so much of our own history in the last 25 or 30 years. Because in a lot of ways, we've done a lot of stuff, and a lot of it follows kind of we do a lot of stuff, and people receive benefit that we don't ever know the people. But in a lot of ways, what we've tried to do is respond to people. First of all, by loving one another in our own body. If we can't love those, we can't love anybody else. But if we can love one another, then we can start to love some other people too. So I think of our director, Joe. He's a really busy guy, and he could make lots and lots of money by doing the things that he does, but he doesn't make lots and lots of money because he doesn't choose to, and it's important not to. But regardless, he goes down to White Castle in the mornings and gets a cup of coffee. And at White Castle, getting his coffee, he gets to know people. And there's a lady in the White Castle, and she's a good lady, and they become friends, and she lives somewhere close in the neighborhood, and she's had an education, but she's got this job at White Castle, and she's got some other things that are holding her back in some ways. And she's also got the federal government wanting her to pay back some student loans from long before, 30 years before. And working at White Castle, there's no way she's ever going to pay back anything for student loans. And so she and Joe get to know one another, and Joe just takes on her student loan issue. And Joe spent about the next year and a half just spending time with her, spending time with the people that administer student loans. And there's not a single person in the federal government that's got anything against this lady, but they've just got a system. There's this process. And when you don't pay back your student loans, the amount goes up, and it just keeps going up. And you might have $5,000 worth of debt, but it might be $100,000 now because you don't pay it back. And that's how it was with her. And over this long extended period, it got resolved. It just got taken care of. How did it get taken care of? I don't know. The same way this guy on the road got taken care of. Somebody just saw this person and got to know this person and took care of it. And we get to do that in a lot of different ways. And so I think of this element of contingency, this element of just by chance. Because in all of our lives, there's all these people that we come across and we get to know just by chance. And I think about all the people that I have had that happen with me, and where that goes, and the opportunities that I've had to get to know people, but to be involved in people's lives. And I could tell you a lot of crazy stories, but about that, but you guys can too. But if we don't take those opportunities, we run across a lot of people every day. We can't get involved with all of them. But there are some people that we can. And as churches, we can too. We can come across opportunities that we didn't expect, but there they are. And we can say, well, no, that's not. a long time ago, back in the 80s, there was a big school building next to our church building. And Indianapolis Public Schools decided they didn't want to use it anymore. And it was one that everybody in the neighborhood had gone to, School 3. And so IPS is going to shut it down, and we could have bought that building for $25,000. That's like giving it to us, you know? And everything worked, everything was fine, but that's not what churches do, of course. And so we didn't have a vision for doing that. We didn't see it as a real gift of God, and we didn't do it. Forward decades, we have the building. We now have the building. It cost us a whole lot more than $25,000. We got the building for free, but by then, a person had used the building for a warehouse for 5 years. Somebody else had used the building for a homeless shelter for a while, and things were pretty deteriorated. And we got it just before the economy collapsed in 2007, and which is always a great, exciting possibility to have something like that just before the economy goes belly up. But those contingent kind of things come along, and there are opportunities that are provided. And so many times we think about God giving us gifts and stuff, but sometimes it looks like an old building that, what are we going to do? And so discernment in the conviction practice story, what are our convictions? And what story do they come from? What story do they tell of God's grace and activity in our neighborhoods? One more quick one, hopefully quick. Luke 17. This is probably my favorite parable. It is my favorite parable. Jesus says, "But which of you, having a slave plowing or tending sheep, will say to him, when he has come in from the field, come immediately and sit down to eat? But will he not say to him, prepare something for me to eat, and properly clothe yourself, and serve me until I have eaten and drunk, and afterward you will eat and drink? He does not thank the slave because he did the things which were commanded, does he? So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded you, say, we are unworthy slaves. We have done only that which we ought to have done." Not a favorite parable of most folks. Just not. We want to be recognized for every little thing we do. We certainly don't want to come in from the fields after a hard day of plowing and fix dinner for somebody else. This last week at Inglewood, we had a group of young people from somewhere in Tennessee, a nice church, a well-to-do church, a good upper, comfortable middle-class church that has a front that overlooks the Smoky Mountains. And it's a great setting. It's not like, overlooking the factory or in our neighborhood. It's just a different thing. And so they came to be with us for a week. And I was thinking about this. I was thinking about this on Thursday, because on Thursday, we've got this older woman who's 71 years old, and she works for the daycare. And she's semi-retired now, so she got up that morning she goes into work at 7. She has to be at work at 7. So she goes into work at 7. She's there. She works all day, and then when she gets off at 3:30, she goes down to the kitchen because we've got this group of kids. And what she does is, when we have groups, she's one of those people who takes care of feeding them. And so then she starts cooking with one of her friends who is a school teacher and is out for the summer. And so they've got stuff all together, and they've prepared food, and they've had food all week, and so they get out leftovers and they prepare more food. And so they have all the food ready and out on tables by 6 o'clock for the kids to eat. And the kids have come in for work. I had the kids during the daytime, and they were hot and sweaty, and they were tired, and they were done. They were just done. But this old lady, 71 years old, she's just getting going, I mean, so she's been at work since 7 o'clock, and now it's 6 o'clock at night. She's got all the food on the table. They come and they devour food, and they throw away their plates, and then she and her friend, well, before that, she had gone to get her grandchildren out of the daycare because she had grandchildren that week too. So she's got grandchildren with her, and she's cooking for a mob of kids, and then after they get done eating, she and Vicki get to clean up and get all the food back in the kitchen, put everything in bags, get all the dishes washed, get the dishwasher shut down, and then load up the grandchildren and head home. And so she gets home 8:45 or something. And it's what she does. It's just what she does, you know? And I marvel at that because, I mean, she started her day at 7 in the morning and her day ended well after 8 at night, and it was a long day. So not only dealing with daycare kids all day, but then dealing with high school kids and their sponsors and the food and her own grandchildren. And she's that kind of person. There's not a lot of that kind of people out there. And that seems to be the kind of people Jesus is encouraging us to be, and the kind of church Jesus is encouraging us to be. So, and not only did that old lady not receive much recognition, but she and I had an anniversary sometime 2 weeks ago, and I forgot completely about it. And I remembered it that night when I was watching her do all this. And she just does it, you know. And we've been married 41 years now, and she's that kind of person. And I wish her husband was a better guy, you know. Did you ever notice that most women marry down? I don't know if you did, but she deserved better, I'll tell you. Anyway, so those are my two parables. We have neighbors, we have friends, and those are some good categories for us to think in. We get a lot of categories for people, you know, homeless or this or that, drug user. I mean, we've got all kinds of stuff going on the east side, and if we wanted to put people in categories, we could. But we've got neighbors and we've got friends, we've got brothers and sisters, and when we start thinking about people in those kind of terms, don't think about them in terms of poor or rich, but friends and neighbors, and how can we care for one another, is where we're at as a church, is where we're at as a people. Things always are in flux and in flow. We're always struggling to know what it is to be the people of God in this place at this time. And that's what I have for you today. What will it be next year? Will Kent invite me back? I do not know. But God bless you all. It's such a delight to be here and just get to touch base with you again.